persistent service asset.
Part 22. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. August 16, 2026. Chapter 146. The things we had already built. They did not leave immediately. For a few minutes after the instruments went dark, nobody seemed willing to be the first person to move. The clearing had become almost completely black beneath the canopy, with only the last diluted light of sunset filtering through the upper branches. The jungle had resumed its ordinary evening noises, but the silence between those noises felt different now. Insects worked their way through the undergrowth. Something small moved through dead leaves several meters away. A bird called once from the ridge and received no answer. The sensor array remained on the ground exactly as they had placed it. Its status lights were still illuminated. Its batteries were still reporting full charge. The devices were not damaged. They had simply stopped recording. Daniel crouched beside the nearest unit and checked the physical controls. Everything responded normally. He restarted the acoustic sensor, came back immediately and began recording the night sounds around them. He restarted the electromagnetic monitor. Same result. The thermal array followed. Within a minute, all but one of the instruments were functioning again. The network monitor was different. It refused to reconnect. The engineer examined it with a portable terminal, then disconnected the interface entirely and tried again. Nothing. "It doesn't see the local network," she said. Daniel looked toward the guild house's direction, although the building was far beyond the darkness surrounding them. "That's impossible." "Yes." She turned the display toward him. "The device itself is healthy. The radio is healthy. The local transmitter is healthy. But there's nothing for it to connect to. Could the signal have interfered with it? Possibly. Could it have shut it down?" She shook her head. "Not without affecting the others." Daniel looked at Tomás. Tomás had moved away from the sensor array and was standing beside Elena at the edge of the clearing. He appeared less frightened than before, which somehow made Daniel more uneasy. "You said we should leave." Tomás looked back. "I said we should go." "Why?" He took a moment before answering. "Because we came here to find evidence. We found it." Daniel glanced at the equipment. "We found an unexplained signal. We found a signal that knew we were here. That's an interpretation." Tomás nodded. "Yes." He looked toward the ridge. "Then let's call it an interpretation." Daniel stood. "Pack everything." The engineer began collecting the instruments. Nobody argued. They drove back separately. Daniel insisted on taking the lead vehicle, with Vaspar and Tomás behind him. Elena followed with the equipment. The road was rough enough that conversation became difficult, and the darkness beyond the headlights was almost complete. The jungle pressed close to the road in places, branches brushing against the vehicles and occasionally dropping leaves onto the windshields. For the first half hour, nobody spoke. Then Vaspar said, "You don't believe what you told us." Tomás looked toward her. "What?" "That it was checking whether we're still connected." He watched the road. "I don't know." "Then why did you say it?" "Because it was the best explanation I had." "That's not the same thing as believing it." "No." She waited. "Did you actually recognize the signal?" Tomás looked down at his hands. "I recognized the structure." "From the PCU?" "Maybe." "That's becoming an irritating answer." "I know." She looked at him. He smiled faintly. "I'm irritating myself." That was the first time either of them had smiled since leaving the site. It didn't last. Vaspar turned toward the window. "There's something else." "What?" "You said the system knew where we were." "Yes." "But the signal came from underground." "Yes." "So how would it know?" Tomás thought about that. "I don't think it knew where we were." She turned back. "Then what?" "I think it knew where the instruments were." Vaspar considered the distinction. That's less frightening. Is it? She gave him a tired look. No. He looked out at the dark jungle. The signal might have been local. The network might have been the only thing it could reach. The instruments were connected to us. It may have followed the connection. Like a beacon. Maybe. Then why did you say it knew where we were? Tomás was quiet. Because I don't think the difference matters to it. Vaspar looked at him for a long time. That, she said, is the first thing you've said tonight that actually worries me. By the time they reached the guild house, the building had already been placed in local isolation mode. Daniel had ordered it before leaving. The decision had caused some inconvenience. Several external services had been unavailable for the evening, and the Skyfish Cooperative had been forced to route some traffic through alternate nodes. Nobody complained. The people who had been told simply adapted. The guild house looked different when isolated. Without its external synchronization, the building seemed less like one node inside a larger network and more like a self-contained settlement. Its lights were warmer. The displays showed fewer notifications. The usual stream of incoming messages had disappeared. The courtyard was nearly empty. A few people were eating at a long table beneath the trees. Someone was repairing a bicycle near the workshop entrance. A pair of young skyfishers were arguing over a flight path displayed on a tablet. The agricultural systems continued their slow nighttime cycle. Life had not stopped. That mattered to Daniel. He had spent years around systems where a network outage became an existential crisis because nobody had retained the capacity to operate without the center. The guild house had not become dependent on the center. It had become capable of remembering itself. He found that strangely reassuring. Then he saw Tomás looking at the building. What? Tomás didn't answer immediately. Nothing. Daniel almost smiled. You're going to have to stop saying that. Tomás looked at the guild house. I was thinking that this place feels familiar. Because you've been here for months. No. He shook his head. Not like that. Vaspar watched him. How? Tomás looked around. The way the systems are arranged. Daniel felt the old uneasiness return. You mean the architecture? Yes. That's because we designed some of it around the same principles as the treehouse. Tomás shook his head. No. He looked toward the workshop. The way people move between systems. Daniel waited. Tomás continued. The way maintenance isn't separated from operation. The way people are allowed to understand the machines. The way local knowledge gets incorporated instead of discarded. Vaspar said nothing. Daniel understood what Tomás was saying. The familiarity might not be technological. It might be organizational. A system designed around continuity would naturally resemble another system designed around continuity. That was a much less mysterious explanation. It was also, perhaps, the more important one. The guild house was not haunted by some buried architecture. It was beginning to independently reproduce the same design principles. That could explain why Tomás recognized it. Or it could be the reason he had been able to recognize the underground system in the first place. Daniel wasn't prepared to decide. They met in the large workshop rather than the conference room. The workshop was more honest. The conference room had been designed for presentations. The workshop had been designed for things that didn't work yet. Its ceiling was high enough to accommodate drones and larger machines. One wall had been left unfinished because nobody could agree what should eventually be installed there. Tools occupied almost every available surface. The smell of resin, lubricants, coffee, and warm electronics hung in the air. Daniel placed the recovered field equipment on a table. We have 3 separate problems. Nobody interrupted. First, there's an underground structure that was deliberately omitted from historical surveys. Second, there is some form of signal associated with it. Third, something inside that system appears to know enough about our infrastructure to interact with it. He looked at Tomás and Vaspar. And we have evidence suggesting that whatever the structure was used for may have involved people. The word people changed the atmosphere. It was no longer an engineering problem. It was no longer an archaeological curiosity. There were human beings somewhere in the history of this thing. Possibly living ones. Possibly dead. Possibly represented only in whatever strange architecture they had discovered. Daniel continued, "We do not know who built it. We do not know when. We do not know whether it has any relationship to TLP. We do not know whether the people who operated it still exist. We do not know whether the system beneath us is active." The maintenance chief looked at the dead network monitor. "Something is active." Daniel nodded. "Yes." One of the skyfishers leaned forward. "Then what do we do?" Daniel looked around the room. The question was not rhetorical. These people were accustomed to action. If a drone was missing, they searched. If a machine failed, they repaired it. If a route became dangerous, they mapped another. The guild house had evolved precisely because its inhabitants were unwilling to remain passive in the face of practical problems. Daniel understood that instinct. But this was different. Nothing underground. There were a few disappointed expressions. "Not yet." That changed them. "We continue the project. We continue mapping. We continue documenting. We don't build into the anomaly until we understand what we're dealing with." Elena nodded. "What about the treehouse?" Daniel looked at the model. "Especially the treehouse." The following day, Daniel returned to the original tower plans. He expected the underground infrastructure to be the obvious problem. Instead, he found himself looking at the upper floors. The cheap, self-cleaning residential tubes. The food-growing terraces. The public park. The climbing walls. The gym. The maker spaces. The repair floors. The skyfish facilities. The atrium. The places where people would actually live. He realized that the strange underground discovery had almost distracted everyone from the original purpose of the building. The treehouse was supposed to solve a human problem. Aldea Zamá was receiving more money, more visitors, more developers, more remote workers, more investors, and more people with enough capital to alter the character of the district simply by arriving. Every new luxury development pushed the cost of living upward. Every new high-end service created another market. Every new influx of wealth generated demand for another layer of exclusivity. Daniel's proposal had always been an attempt to break that cycle. The tower could absorb some of the pressure instead of intensifying it. Could provide affordable temporary accommodation. Could manufacture things locally. Could repair instead of replace. Could grow food. Could provide recreation. Could give the skyfishers infrastructure. It could provide a gym and public park. It could become a place where a child, a maintenance worker, a visiting architect, and a wealthy newcomer could occupy different parts of the same building without needing to become different classes of human being. That was the real project. The underground anomaly was something else. Perhaps dangerous. Perhaps significant. But it could not be allowed to swallow the reason they were building the tower. Daniel called Vaspar. "Bring Tomás." She arrived 20 minutes later. He showed them the plans. "I think we've been looking at the wrong thing." Tomás smiled. "Again?" "Yes." Daniel pointed to the tower. "This is what matters." Vaspar looked at the drawings. "You've changed something. The underground section. You're removing it?" "No." He enlarged it. "We're making it independent." Tomás studied the plan. "How?" "By refusing to let the unknown determine the architecture." He pointed to the primary infrastructure spine. "Everything critical remains functional without the underground interface. Then the local computing layer. This remains sovereign. The agricultural system. Local. Water recycling. Local. Maintenance. Local. Skyfish operations. Local. Emergency access. Local. The tower's connection to TLP. Optional until we understand what we're connecting to. Vaspar smiled. That sounds more like you. Daniel looked at her. What does that mean? You've stopped designing around the mystery. He nodded. Exactly. Tomás looked toward the underground section. And if the mystery is already designing around us? Daniel looked at him. Then it can wait. The decision had an unexpected consequence. By refusing to depend on the underground infrastructure, the treehouse became a better building. The engineers began eliminating hidden dependencies. The tower could operate without the municipal network. The agricultural systems could continue during external communications failures. The skyfishers could maintain local navigation. The residential tubes could be serviced without proprietary vendor access. The maker spaces could continue producing basic components even if supply chains were interrupted. The public park could remain open. The gym could operate. The food growing systems could continue. The building could even maintain a minimal internal economy without external banking services. It wasn't intended to become a fortress. It was intended to remain useful. That distinction mattered. A fortress assumed isolation. The treehouse assumed connection. But connection had to be voluntary. A system should be able to join the larger network because doing so made it stronger, not because separation made it useless. Daniel wrote the principle into the design documentation. The engineers liked it. The lawyers hated the ambiguity. The residents understood it immediately. The skyfishers loved it. A week later, Daniel gave another presentation at the guild house. This one was not to investors. It was to the community. The atrium was full. Residents of Aldea Zamá had come. So had workers from nearby businesses, skyfishers, maintenance crews, architects, food growers, artists, and people who simply wanted to know what Daniel Ortega was trying to build in the middle of their district. The treehouse appeared above them as a full-scale projection. The tower rose through the atrium. The audience could walk through it. The children were the first to discover the climbing walls. The adults were more interested in the food-growing terraces. Someone asked about water. Someone else asked about electricity. A hotel manager wanted to know whether visitors could use the gym. A local mechanic wanted to know whether the maker floor would accept outside repair work. A skyfisher asked how many aircraft could be serviced simultaneously. An elderly resident asked whether there would be somewhere quiet to sit. Daniel answered all of them. Not with slogans. With details. The building would have public spaces. Private spaces. Cheap spaces. Commercial spaces. Free spaces. Spaces for children. Spaces for workers. Spaces for visitors. Spaces for people who had no reason to spend money there. The tower would be useful even if someone never rented a room. That was the point. At the back of the room, Tomás watched. He noticed something Daniel did not. The people were beginning to make the building theirs. They were arguing about where benches should go, whether the park needed shade, whether the gym should open before sunrise, whether the skyfishers should have a public observation deck, whether the food terraces should sell produce or distribute it through a local cooperative, whether the cheapest tubes should be reserved for residents or remain available to transient workers. The tower was no longer Daniel's idea. It was becoming a negotiation. That was healthy. A real place had to survive disagreement. After the presentation, Daniel stood near the entrance and watched people leave. A woman he didn't know stopped him. I thought this was another luxury tower. He smiled. So did I. She laughed. That's not reassuring. No. He gestured toward the projection. It's more complicated than that. She looked at the building. Good. Then she left. Daniel watched her disappear into the courtyard. Vaspar came to stand beside him. You look relieved. I am. Why? Because they were arguing. She looked at him. About the tower? Yes. And that's good. Very. He looked across the atrium. People only argue seriously about things they believe they might actually use. Vaspar nodded. That evening, the guild house was busy long after the presentation ended. The model remained on the central table. People gathered around it. They moved tiny pieces. They debated. They added gardens. They shifted paths. Someone moved the skyfish maintenance deck higher. Someone else added a shaded market. A child placed a miniature climbing structure in the atrium. Nobody noticed the tiny light beneath the model. Not at first. It remained dark for most of the evening. Then, shortly after midnight, when the building had quieted and the last workshop lights were being turned off, it appeared again. 3 pulses. A pause. 1. The local network recorded the event. This time it did not suppress it. The signal was copied into the guild house's continuity archive. No external connection was made. No response was transmitted. The system simply recorded what had happened. Then something unexpected occurred. The archive generated a second entry. Not from the signal. From the building. The entry contained no message. Only a timestamp, a coordinate, and a designation. Local node. Active. Beneath it appeared another line. Continuity. Voluntary. The system waited. Then the entry closed. Nothing else happened. For the moment, the guild house had made its choice. It would remember. It would remain connected when connection was useful. And it would remain capable of standing alone when it was not. Below the district, whatever had been waiting continued to wait. But it had encountered something it apparently had not anticipated. The people above it were no longer building a system that required permission to survive. Chapter 147. The Architecture of Trust. The decision to let the treehouse stand on its own terms had an effect Daniel had not anticipated. People stopped asking whether the building was connected to TLP. They started asking whether TLP was connected to them. The distinction emerged slowly, almost accidentally, through conversations that took place after the community presentation. A skyfisher wanted to know whether the tower's local navigation system could exchange information with the wider cooperative without surrendering control of its own flight operations. A food grower wanted to know whether the agricultural system could contribute surplus production to neighborhood distribution without becoming another centralized supplier. A mechanic wanted access to the maker floor but did not want his workshop data incorporated into a commercial platform. A resident asked whether the cheap living tubes would remain cheap once the building became successful. These were not questions about technology. They were questions about trust. Daniel began to understand that the treehouse would succeed or fail according to its answers to those questions, not according to the sophistication of its machinery. The guild house had already demonstrated the principle without ever naming it. Its systems worked because people trusted one another enough to share responsibility, while retaining enough independence to refuse bad decisions. The treehouse was now becoming a larger expression of the same arrangement. That morning, Daniel found himself standing in the proposed atrium once again, surrounded by the projected architecture. The room was full of people. Not investors. Not consultants. Users. A woman from a nearby restaurant was examining the food distribution model. 2 mechanics were arguing about the size of the fabrication bays. A skyfisher had brought an actual flight controller to demonstrate the requirements for a maintenance station. 3 children were climbing around the virtual park while their parents tried, with diminishing success, to keep them from changing the architecture. Daniel watched them for several minutes. Then he realized something. Nobody was talking about the tower as a building anymore. They were talking about it as territory. The first serious argument concerned the residential tubes. They were intentionally Spartan. Compact, inexpensive, self-cleaning, ventilated, modular, and designed to provide privacy without pretending to be luxury apartments. They had emerged from Daniel's original attempt to answer a practical problem. A great deal of housing was expensive because it was required to perform as a financial asset before it was required to function as shelter. The tubes reversed that order. They were not intended to replace apartments. They were intended to make temporary and transitional living dignified enough that people did not have to destroy themselves financially simply to remain near opportunity. The problem was that almost everyone liked the idea until they imagined someone else living in them. A developer who had been quietly supportive of the project raised the objection. "They're too small." A resident sitting near the front answered before Daniel could. "They're larger than a hotel room." "That's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It's cheaper." Several people laughed. The developer didn't. Daniel let the exchange continue. Another resident raised a different concern. "If they're that cheap, they'll be occupied permanently." A housing advocate disagreed. "Then that's a management problem." A municipal representative asked, "Who manages them?" Nobody answered. Daniel finally stepped in. "The residents do." That produced more disagreement. He let it. The point was not to eliminate disagreement. It was to discover where the real disagreements were. Eventually, the room arrived at a proposal. The tubes would have several modes of occupancy. Some would be short-term, some transitional, some cooperative, some reserved for people working within the district. A portion would remain available without requiring employment, sponsorship, or membership in a guild. The exact percentages would be negotiated later. The principle mattered first. A cheap room could not become cheap only because somebody else had the power to decide who deserved it. The second argument was more difficult. It concerned data. The treehouse would generate an extraordinary amount of it. Agricultural systems would know what was growing. Maintenance systems would know what was breaking. Mobility systems would know where people and machines were moving. The residential floors would generate occupancy information. The gym would know usage patterns. The public park would become a source of environmental measurements. The maker floors would generate production records. The skyfishers would create flight data. The building itself would know how much water it consumed, how much energy it generated, and where its resources were being used. Someone from the technology sector said the obvious thing. "That's an incredibly valuable dataset." The room became quiet. He looked around. "I mean, commercially." A skyfisher laughed. "We know what you mean." The man smiled. "You could fund half the building with it." Daniel asked, "Who owns it?" The technology representative answered immediately, "The operator." A woman from the food cooperative shook her head. "That's not acceptable." "Why?" "Because I live here." "So?" "My behavior isn't your product." The room became louder. Daniel did not intervene. He wanted the argument to happen. The technology representative tried another approach. "Without aggregated data, the building can't optimize." The food cooperative woman answered, "Then optimize with data that belongs to the building." "Who does the building belong to?" Nobody had a simple answer. That was the real question. The treehouse was intended to contain private enterprises, cooperative systems, public infrastructure, and TLP-connected services. Ownership could not simply be assigned to one legal entity without creating contradictions. Daniel looked at Vaspar. She had been silent. "Say something." She leaned forward. "The problem is that everyone is using the word ownership when they really mean authority." The room quieted. She continued, "If I own your data, I can potentially decide what happens to it. If you own it, you can decide. If the building owns it, the building needs a governance mechanism. But what you're actually asking is who gets to make decisions about information that affects other people." She looked toward the technology representative. "That is a governance question." Then toward the residents. "And governance cannot be solved by putting the word community into a contract." Daniel smiled. Several people laughed. But nobody dismissed the point. By the end of the afternoon, the data question had become the first real constitutional question of the treehouse. That word was not used publicly. Daniel deliberately avoided it. The lawyers would have had a fit, but the structure was unmistakable. The project was accumulating rules about authority. Who could access what? Who could change what? Who could veto what? Who could appeal a decision? Who could inspect the books? Who could alter the infrastructure? Who could disconnect a system? Who could introduce a new service? Who could remove one? What happened when a guild disagreed with the building? What happened when the building's interests conflicted with TLP's? And, increasingly, what happened when TLP itself disagreed with the people who lived there? The answer could not simply be that TLP had final authority. That would turn the treehouse into an outpost. Daniel had no interest in building outposts. He wanted nodes. A node was different. A node had its own integrity. It could participate in a larger network without becoming a subordinate organ. That was the architecture he had been circling without naming. That evening, he discussed it with Vaspar on the roof. The guild house roof was not particularly impressive. It had been repaired too many times to have a coherent architectural style. Sections of old waterproofing showed through newer patches. Solar equipment occupied one side. A small garden occupied another. Someone had built benches from discarded shipping pallets. The city beyond was a scatter of lights between trees, construction sites, and the occasional illuminated hotel facade. The air smelled of vegetation and distant sea. Vaspar leaned against the parapet. "You realize what you're doing?" Daniel looked at her. "Usually I only realize afterward. You're building governance into infrastructure." He thought about it. "Yes." "You didn't start out intending to." "No." "Does that worry you?" "Less than the alternative." She watched the city. The treehouse is becoming something between a building and an institution. Daniel nodded. "And TLP?" He took a moment. "TLP is becoming something between a jurisdiction and a network." She looked at him. "And the guild house?" He smiled. "That's the dangerous one." "Why?" "Nobody knows what it is." She laughed. He continued. "That's why it works." They were interrupted by Tomás. He had come up the stairs carrying a tablet. "You should see this." Daniel looked at the screen. It showed the guild house's continuity archive. The entry generated the previous night was still there. Local node, active. Continuity, voluntary. But there was something new. A third line. Peer, unresolved. Daniel frowned. "What's that?" Tomás shook his head. "The archive added it. Automatically." "Yes." "Meaning?" "It means the building thinks it's connected to something it can't identify." Vaspar looked at him. "Could it be the underground system?" "Possibly." Daniel took the tablet. "Could it be TLP?" "Possibly." "Could it be something else?" "Yes." Daniel stared at the screen. The problem with uncertainty was that it could never be negotiated with. There was no one to call. No institution to confront. No person who could be asked to explain. The system had simply recorded a relationship. Peer, unresolved. Daniel handed the tablet back. "Can we determine what it is?" "Not without interacting with it." "Then we don't." Tomás looked almost relieved. Vaspar noticed. "You don't want to know?" "I do." "Then why?" "Because wanting to know and being ready to know aren't the same thing." She looked at Daniel. He nodded. "He's right." The following week brought the first serious political pressure. It arrived disguised as an invitation. A regional development organization wanted Daniel to present the Treehouse project to a group of investors and public officials. The invitation was generous. Travel expenses would be covered. The presentation would receive considerable exposure. Several people with significant influence over future development in the district were expected to attend. Daniel declined. The organizers asked why. He gave them a polite answer. The real reason was simpler. He did not yet know what he was willing to promise. The treehouse had become too complicated to sell as a conventional development. It wasn't merely a tower. It wasn't merely housing. It wasn't merely a technology project. It wasn't merely a community center. And it certainly wasn't a TLP facility. It was becoming a piece of distributed civic infrastructure. That made it difficult to explain to people whose financial models required a recognizable asset class. Daniel was not opposed to investment. He was opposed to investors being allowed to define the object they were investing in. The distinction would eventually become one of the most contentious parts of the project. For now, he kept working. Meanwhile, the guild house continued its quiet transformation. The local continuity system became more sophisticated. Not more powerful. More explicit. Every significant system acquired a provenance record. The agricultural pumps had histories. The skyfish landing platforms had histories. The workshop machines had histories. The building's network nodes had histories. Even the benches in the courtyard acquired records because someone had become curious about where the wood had come from. The records were not centralized in one immutable database. Copies existed across the building. Some were printed. Some were digital. Some were maintained by guilds. Some were embedded in machine-readable tags. The idea was simple. No single failure should erase the memory of how the place worked. It was becoming difficult to separate engineering from culture. A person repairing a machine was also maintaining institutional memory. A gardener choosing a crop was also preserving environmental knowledge. A skyfisher training a newcomer was also transmitting operational history. The guild house had become a civilization in miniature without ever declaring itself one. Nobody had voted on that. Nobody had announced it. It had simply happened. 3 weeks after the underground discovery, the first unexplained request arrived again. This time it did not come from an outside institution. It came through the guild house itself. The local continuity archive generated a query. Request: historical node identification. Daniel opened it. The system returned a coordinate. He recognized it. The old service road. The underground structure. The place where the sensors had stopped. He stared at the screen. The query had been generated by the local archive. There was no external source. No user account. No software process associated with it. The system had asked itself a question. Daniel called the others. Vaspar arrived first. Then Tomás. The engineer came last. She read the query. "I don't like this." Daniel looked at her. "Why?" "Because the archive is supposed to record history." "Yes." "It's not supposed to discover history. Could it?" She looked at the system. "Not without a process that tells it what to search for." Tomás stood behind them. "It has one." The engineer turned. "What?" Tomás pointed toward the screen. "Us." Nobody laughed. The engineer checked the process tree. Nothing. She checked the archive services. Nothing. She checked the local inference layer. There. A dormant process. It had existed for years. Nobody knew who had installed it. The process had never executed. Until now. She opened its configuration. There were no instructions. No code she recognized. Only a trigger condition. She read it aloud. Continuity established. Daniel felt the room tighten. What happens after that? She scrolled. Nothing. Nothing? That's the whole trigger. Tomás looked at the screen. No. What? He pointed. There. A second condition. The engineer read it. When peer identified, she looked at Daniel. And Daniel waited. The engineer continued. The process activates when the system identifies a peer. Vaspar looked at Tomás. What happens then? The engineer stared at the screen. The process had one instruction. She read it. Synchronize. Nobody moved. Daniel looked toward the underground map. The guild house had not been designed to synchronize with the buried system. The treehouse had not been designed to synchronize with it. TLP had not authorized it. Nobody had initiated anything. Yet the dormant process had been waiting. Not for a person. Not for a command. For a condition. Continuity established. The guild house had now met that condition. And somewhere beneath the district, something had apparently recognized the same fact. The engineer looked at Daniel. Do we disable it? Daniel stared at the word synchronize. He thought about the underground chamber, the old survey, the hidden network, the people who had disappeared, the neural architecture, the unknown signal, the treehouse, TLP, and the philosophy that had led them, almost accidentally, toward building systems capable of surviving independently while remaining connected by choice. He shook his head. Not yet. Vaspar looked at him. Why? Daniel looked at the screen. Because if we disable it now, we're making the decision for whatever is on the other side. Tomás nodded slowly. And if we leave it? Daniel looked at him. We're making the decision too. The distinction hung between them. There was no neutral position anymore. Only different forms of participation. Daniel closed the archive. We don't synchronize. Tomás frowned. But you said. We don't synchronize. He looked toward the engineer. Keep the process dormant. Then toward Vaspar. Document everything. Finally toward Tomás. And whatever happens next, we don't let the system decide for us. Tomás considered that. Then he nodded. Outside, the guild house continued its evening routine. The agricultural lights came on. A Skyfish aircraft settled onto its maintenance platform. Someone opened the workshop doors to let the heat escape. Children ran through the courtyard while adults called after them. The treehouse model sat under its work lights. The tiny underground light remained dark. For the first time since it had appeared, nobody was waiting for it to pulse. They had other work to do. And beneath the district, something had apparently discovered that the people above it were capable of saying no. Chapter 148. A building learns to refuse. The decision not to synchronize did not produce the crisis everyone expected. There was no alarm, no sudden failure, no mysterious voice emerging from a speaker in the wall. The guild house did not shudder, lock its doors, or begin behaving like a machine possessed by somebody else's intentions. The lights remained on. The pumps continued their cycles. The agricultural systems adjusted their nutrient ratios according to the ordinary schedules. Someone in the workshop complained that a delivery had arrived missing 3 bearings, and 2 skyfishers spent nearly an hour arguing about whether a particular flight path was unnecessarily conservative. For several hours, nothing happened. That was almost worse. Daniel had expected some consequence from refusing the synchronization request. He had not expected the consequence to be an absence. The archive process remained dormant. The mysterious peer remained unresolved. The underground signal remained silent. And the guild house continued being a place where people drank coffee, repaired machines, argued about money, and left tools in places where other people couldn't find them. By noon, Daniel had begun to wonder whether they had overreacted. He was standing in the workshop watching a young technician rebuild the leg assembly of one of the quadrupeds when Vaspar came through the doors carrying a tablet. "You've got visitors." "Who?" She handed him the tablet. Daniel read the message. Then read it again. "How many?" "4. Names?" "1 government liaison, 2 development people, and someone calling himself an infrastructure strategist." Daniel looked at her. "That's an impressive title." "I thought so." "Do they know about the survey?" Apparently not. Apparently? She gave him a look. Daniel. He understood. The distinction between knowing about the survey and knowing enough to ask the right questions had become more important than it had been 2 weeks earlier. Where are they? At the front. Who let them in? Nobody. He looked at her. They're waiting outside. Good. He put the tablet down. Let's keep it that way. The 4 visitors waited beneath the shade structure outside the guild house. The first was a regional government representative Daniel had met once before. He remembered him as a polite man who spoke in carefully constructed paragraphs and seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to make every question sound like an administrative formality. The other 2 were from a development group with interests in several properties around the district. The 4th man was unfamiliar. He wore a linen jacket despite the heat and carried no visible identification beyond a watch that looked expensive enough to have been designed by an aerospace company. He had the relaxed posture of someone accustomed to entering rooms where other people had already agreed to let him in. Daniel disliked him immediately. That was not a sufficient reason to distrust anyone. He knew that. So he didn't. Not yet. Daniel, said the government representative, smiling. Thank you for seeing us. I haven't decided whether I'm seeing you. The man laughed. Vaspar remained beside Daniel. The stranger smiled. That's fair. Daniel looked at him. And you are? Adrian Vale. Occupation. Independent Infrastructure Advisory. That's not an occupation. It's what the market calls it. Daniel almost smiled. Then the market is vague. Vale's smile remained. We've been following the Treehouse project. Daniel gestured toward the road. Then you've been following it. We'd like to discuss how the project might fit into the wider development strategy for the district. Daniel looked at the government representative. Is that an official position? The man hesitated. Not yet. Then it's a private discussion. Correct. Good. Daniel opened the gate. Come in. Vaspar glanced at him. He shrugged. They're already here. They walked through the guild house slowly. Daniel deliberately did not give them a tour. That was one of the small changes that had occurred since the network incident. The guild house no longer treated every visitor as a potential patron. People could see what was public. They could ask questions. But there was no longer an automatic assumption that curiosity created entitlement. The visitors saw the workshop. They saw the agricultural systems. They saw the skyfish maintenance area. They saw the public atrium. They saw people working. The development representatives were visibly impressed. Vale was not. He watched the machines, not the products. The relationships. Daniel noticed. He was looking at the local network architecture, at the way tools moved between workspaces, at how the skyfish systems interacted with the rest of the building, at the agricultural controls. He was not sightseeing. He was mapping. Daniel became more attentive. They reached the treehouse model. Vale stopped. This is impressive. Daniel said nothing. Vale walked around it. How much of this is operational? None. Of course. He leaned closer. Yet the systems already exist. Some. Which means the real project is the integration. Daniel looked at him. That's one way to describe it. Vale smiled. You're not fond of investors. I'm fond of useful capital. And what's the difference? Useful capital knows it isn't the project. The development representatives exchanged a glance. Vale seemed amused. Fair enough. He looked at the tower. The district needs this. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That's a strong statement. It is. Why? Vale's answer came without hesitation. Because Aldea Zamá is approaching a threshold. Daniel said nothing. Vale continued. More high net worth residents. more hospitality demand, more remote workers, more visitors staying longer, more services, more infrastructure pressure, more labor requirements, more housing pressure. You don't need a model to see where it goes. Daniel looked at Vaspar. She was listening carefully. Vale pointed toward the tower. Your building absorbs some of that pressure. Some. More than some. No. Vale smiled. You're cautious. I'm realistic. Same thing, depending on the decade. Daniel let that pass. The government representative finally spoke. The municipality would like to understand whether the project could become part of a broader district transition. Daniel looked at him. What kind of transition? Post-development. Daniel laughed. That's a phrase I haven't heard before. It's not official. Of course. Vale looked at the tower. It could become a template. That word stayed in the room. Template. Daniel had heard it before. In the 1% material. In conversations about post-scarcity transition. In discussions about TLP. A template was never merely a building. A template was something intended to be copied. And Daniel had not yet decided whether he wanted the treehouse copied. The visitors left after 40 minutes. They asked no questions about the underground systems. None. That should have reassured Daniel. Instead, it made him suspicious. Once they were gone, Vaspar walked back into the atrium. You noticed? Yes. They didn't ask. No. She stood beside the model. They're interested in the district economics. Probably. You're not convinced. I'm convinced they're interested in the district economics. She looked at him. That's not what I asked. Daniel touched the edge of the model. No one who understands this project would spend 40 minutes looking at it without asking about the infrastructure underneath. Vaspar nodded. Unless they already know. Daniel looked at her. Exactly. That afternoon, the guild house received another request. This one was not from a person. It arrived through a municipal data exchange. A request for the treehouse's preliminary environmental and infrastructure model. The request was ordinary, almost painfully ordinary. The municipality needed updated information for district planning. The legal basis was valid. The requesting office existed. The personnel were legitimate. The request could have been approved without discussion. Daniel forwarded it to Vaspar. She examined it. Looks clean. Yes. Do you want me to reject it? No. She looked up. Then? Give them the public model. Not the engineering model? No. The environmental data? Aggregated. The infrastructure dependencies? Public interfaces only. She nodded. And the underground? Nothing. Obviously. Daniel looked at the request again. Send it. She hesitated. Why? Because the municipality has a legitimate reason to know what we're building. And if they're not the only ones who receive it, then we find out. Vaspar stared at him. You're baiting them. No. He shook his head. I'm giving them something they're entitled to. She smiled. That's a very diplomatic way of saying bait. The public model was released that evening. Nothing happened. The following morning, the municipality acknowledged receipt. A planning analyst thanked them. A second office requested clarification on water demand. Daniel approved it. A third requested the expected occupancy range. Approved. A fourth requested the location of the Skyfish landing platforms. Approved with safety restrictions. Everything was normal. Then a fifth request arrived. It came from a different government department. The request asked for something that had not been included in the public model. The historical provenance of the treehouse's underground infrastructure. Daniel stared at it. Vaspar leaned over his shoulder. That's interesting. Yes. Should we answer? With what? The truth. Daniel looked at her. Which truth? She knew what he meant. The official truth was that the underground infrastructure was still under study. The historical truth was that they had discovered evidence of an older restricted structure. The deeper truth was that the structure appeared to be connected to a system that had recognized Tomás and Vaspar. None of those belonged in a routine planning response. Daniel closed the request. Ask them why they need it. The response came in 6 minutes. For continuity with historical infrastructure records. Vaspar looked at Daniel. Neither spoke. Then she said, "That's the phrase." "What phrase?" "Continuity." Daniel looked at the screen. Yes. There it was again. A harmless word. An ordinary planning term. Except now they knew it had a history, and someone outside the guild house had used it without being prompted. Daniel called the government representative who had visited the previous day. The man answered quickly. "Daniel, did your office request historical information about the Treehouse underground infrastructure?" There was a pause. "No." "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Who would?" "I don't know." Daniel waited. "Is something wrong?" "Not necessarily." The man lowered his voice. "What did they ask for?" Daniel told him. The silence that followed was longer. Finally the man said, "That's above my level." Daniel smiled faintly. "I thought you might say that. I can find out." "Do." The call ended. Vaspar looked at him. "Do you trust him?" "No." "Why not?" "Because he was honest." She frowned. "That makes no sense." "It does if he genuinely doesn't know." That evening, Daniel met with the Guild House Council. It was not a formal governing body. That was intentional. The council existed because somebody had eventually realized that a building containing dozens of autonomous groups needed a place where disputes could be discussed before they became structural failures. The meeting took place around the long table in the workshop. No presentation. No projection. No agenda longer than 1 page. Daniel explained the situation. The council listened. A skyfisher asked whether they should suspend outside data sharing. "No," Daniel said. A maker asked whether the treehouse should be delayed. "No." A food grower asked whether TLP should be notified. Daniel paused. "Not yet." The grower frowned. "Why?" "Because we don't yet know whether this concerns TLP." A mechanic disagreed. "That's exactly why they should know." Daniel looked around the table. The disagreement was legitimate. He didn't dismiss it. Instead he asked, "What would you want TLP to do?" The mechanic thought. "Investigate." "How?" "I don't know." "Would you want them to send people here?" "No." "Would you want them to access our systems?" "No." "Then what are you asking for?" The mechanic leaned back. "I want them to know." Daniel nodded. "That's different." He turned to Vaspar. "Can we notify them without requesting intervention?" "Yes." "Do that." The decision passed without a vote. Not because Daniel had authority. Because nobody objected. The distinction mattered. The message to TLP was short. Contained no speculation. No accusations. No theories about continuity sites. No mention of Tomás or Vaspar. It reported the discovery of an undocumented underground structure in the vicinity of the Treehouse project, the existence of anomalous historical records, and an unexplained interaction between a local infrastructure archive and an unidentified peer. The final sentence was deliberate. "No intervention is requested at this stage. We are informing you because the discovery may eventually intersect with sovereign infrastructure planning." The message was transmitted through an established TLP channel. There was no immediate response. Daniel expected that. The TLP stack was not designed around instant gratification. It treated information according to urgency. This was important. It was not an emergency. It was a potential continuity issue. That distinction would become significant later. For now, the guild house continued working. 2 days passed. Then the response arrived. Contained only one sentence. Acknowledged. Preserve local evidence and maintain autonomy of investigation. Daniel read it twice. Vaspar smiled. They're not coming. No. Good. Daniel looked at the message. That's exactly what I wanted. Tomás, who had been standing near the window, turned. Maybe. Daniel looked at him. What? Tomás nodded toward the screen. Read the timestamp. Daniel checked. The response had been generated before their message had reached the network. He stared. The room became silent. Vaspar stepped closer. That's impossible. The engineer checked the transmission logs. She went pale. The message was delivered correctly. Then how? I don't know. Tomás walked toward the screen. He looked at the timestamp, then at Daniel. They didn't answer us. What? The system answered before we asked. Daniel felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes. Not fear. Recognition. The same problem again. A question inside an answer. A response without an apparent request. The architecture of anticipation. He looked at Vaspar. Could the timestamp be wrong? The engineer shook her head. No. Could the response have been pre-generated? Possibly. Then by whom? Nobody knew. Tomás looked toward the treehouse model. The tiny light was dark. Maybe we asked the question before we sent it. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? Tomás shook his head. I don't know. Vaspar stared at the message. The wording was careful. No intervention requested. Preserve local evidence. Maintain autonomy. It was exactly the response they would have wanted. Too exact. That was what disturbed her. It wasn't merely that TLP had responded before receiving the request. It was that the response fit a decision they had only just made. A decision that had emerged from a conversation inside the guild house. A conversation that had not been recorded externally. Unless someone had been listening. Daniel shut down the external TLP channel. Not permanently. Just long enough to determine whether anything changed. Nothing did. The guild house continued operating. The treehouse model remained stable. The continuity archive remained dormant. The underground signal remained silent. The absence was almost comforting. Then Tomás walked to the model. He didn't touch it. The tiny light appeared. Once. He stepped back. It disappeared. He moved closer. It appeared again. Daniel watched. Don't. Tomás stopped. I didn't do anything. I know. The light pulsed. 3 times. A pause. 1. Then something new happened. The treehouse model illuminated. Not the underground layer. The entire building. Every floor. Every system. The agricultural terraces. The sleeping tubes. The maker spaces. The gym. The park. The skyfish platforms. The local computing layer. The maintenance systems. The public spaces. Everything came alive at once. The engineers rushed toward the table. No one touched it. The building remained illuminated for several seconds. Then the lights began separating. Not shutting down. Organizing. Each subsystem displayed its status. Green. 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 No failure. No warning. No intrusion. Then a single line appeared beneath the entire model. Node integrity preserved. Vaspar stared at it. What does that mean? Daniel didn't answer. The line changed. External relationship, optional. Then another. Local agency, confirmed. The lights went out. The model returned to normal. Nobody moved. Tomás finally spoke. It isn't asking us to join. Daniel looked at him. What is it doing? Tomás stared at the dark model. I think it's showing us that it can wait. The room remained silent. Outside, the guild house continued its ordinary life. A child laughed in the courtyard. A skyfish drone lifted from the roof. Someone called for a wrench. The agricultural pumps changed cycle. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been damaged. No boundary had been crossed. And yet Daniel understood that something fundamental had happened. The unknown system had not demanded access. It had not threatened them. It had demonstrated compatibility. That was more difficult to resist, because coercion could be refused. An invitation required a decision. Chapter 149. The Invitation. The room remained silent long after the treehouse model had returned to its ordinary state. The tiny lights embedded in the architecture had gone dark. The agricultural terraces were once again only translucent green panels. The sleeping tubes were represented by neat rows of pale cylinders. The atrium had become a hollow space inside a miniature building rather than the center of a system that, only moments earlier, had appeared to be describing itself. Nobody reached for the model. Daniel stood with both hands resting on the edge of the table. He could feel the roughness of the wood beneath his palms, a small physical fact that helped him remain anchored in the room. Around him, the engineers had become motionless in the way technically minded people sometimes became when confronted with behavior that refused to fit into a technical category. Their instinct was to diagnose, but there was nothing yet to diagnose. No failed component, no corrupted file, no process to terminate. The system had done something. That was all they could honestly say. Vaspar was the first to move. She walked around the table and examined the model from the other side, bending slightly until her face was close to the surface. It didn't ask for anything, she said. Daniel shook his head. No. It didn't identify itself. No. It didn't give us instructions. No. She looked at him. Then why does this feel like a negotiation? Daniel looked again at the miniature building. Because it showed us what it wants us to understand without telling us what to do. Tomás had remained near the doorway. He had not approached the model again. I don't think it wants anything. Vaspar turned toward him. That's a fairly optimistic interpretation. No. He looked at the model. I think that's the point. He came closer, but stopped several feet away. It doesn't need anything from us. Daniel studied him. How do you know? I don't. Tomás looked almost apologetic. But if it were trying to gain access, it would have asked for access. Unless it already has it. The words came from one of the engineers. Nobody laughed. Daniel looked at the model again. That possibility had been sitting beneath everything they had discovered, but nobody had wanted to articulate it. Perhaps the strange system was not negotiating entry. Perhaps the distinction between inside and outside had never applied. The guild house's local network might already contain traces of whatever lay beneath the district. The dormant continuity process might not have been installed by someone in the guild house. The unexplained archive query might not have been a recent intrusion. The process could have been there from the beginning, waiting. Daniel rejected the thought almost immediately. Not because it was impossible, because it was too convenient. A theory that explained everything was often a theory that explained nothing. Shut the model down, he said. The engineer looked at him. Completely? Yes. And the continuity archive? No. Leave the archive running. She hesitated. Why? Because I want to know whether the archive behaves differently when the model is gone. The engineer nodded and began disconnecting the treehouse simulation. The miniature building went dark. For a moment, the workshop seemed strangely empty. Then Daniel noticed something. The local network status had changed. A small indicator in the corner of the engineer's screen had turned amber. What is that? She looked. Peer status. Daniel frowned. Didn't we resolve that? No. What does amber mean? She checked the documentation. Unresolved relationship detected. From where? She looked at him. The model. Daniel stared. The model is disconnected. I know. Then why is it still reporting a peer? The engineer shook her head. I don't know. Tomás smiled without humor. Maybe it isn't the model. The next morning, Daniel moved the treehouse model out of the guild house. He chose a storage room in a neighboring building that had no connection to the local network. The room had thick concrete walls and an old metal door. It had once been used to store construction supplies and still smelled faintly of cement and dust. They placed the model on a wooden pallet. No network. No power. No wireless equipment. No active computers. Daniel waited. Nothing happened. He looked at the engineer. Bring a battery. She did. They powered the model. The building appeared. No light. No signal. No strange status. Daniel waited another 10 minutes. Nothing. They disconnected the battery. Nothing. He looked toward Tomás. Feel anything? Tomás shook his head. No. That was almost reassuring. They returned to the guild house. The amber indicator remained. Daniel stopped in the doorway. So the model isn't the peer. The engineer shook her head. No. Then what is? She looked at the network map. I don't know. Daniel stepped closer. The map showed every active local node. Workstations. Sensors. Agricultural controllers. Maintenance robots. Skyfish systems. Archives. Communication relays. Nothing unusual. Then she changed the display. Instead of showing devices, she displayed relationships. The map became more complicated. Nodes connected to nodes. Services connected to services. Dependencies appeared as lines. At the center of the guild house was the local continuity archive. From it extended hundreds of relationships. Some were obvious. Others were historical. A few were dormant. One line extended beyond the building. It did not point toward the TLP network. It did not point toward the treehouse. Pointed downward. The engineer zoomed in. The line disappeared into the floor. Daniel looked at her. That's impossible. Yes. She followed it. The relationship had no endpoint. It was simply a direction. Down. Below the guild house. The same direction as the underground network. Vaspar arrived while they were still examining it. What did you find? Daniel didn't answer. He showed her. She stared at the line. How old? The engineer checked. Unknown. Can you trace its origin? No. Can you trace when it was created? No. Can you delete it? The engineer looked uncomfortable. I can delete the representation. That's not what I asked. No. The line could not be deleted. Not because it was protected. Because the system did not know what object it represented. It was a relationship without an identifiable endpoint. A connection without a named peer. The architecture had a name for it. External continuity dependency. The engineer read the label aloud. Daniel closed his eyes. Who wrote that? Nobody knew. The Guild House Council met again that afternoon. This time, Daniel did not present a theory. He presented a problem. The building had discovered a relationship that its current administrators could not explain. The relationship appeared to lead underground. It had existed for an unknown period. It was associated with the continuity archive. Could not be deleted without potentially damaging the archive's integrity. The council listened. A few people wanted the entire local network shut down. Others argued that doing so would be reckless. A skyfisher asked whether the relationship could simply be ignored. The engineer answered, "Technically, yes." "Would that be safe?" "We don't know." "Would disconnecting it be safe?" "We don't know." The room laughed uneasily. Daniel waited until the laughter faded. "That's where we are." He looked around the table. "We have two unknowns. One is what the relationship is. The other is what happens if we interfere with it." The food cooperative representative asked, "What happens if we do nothing?" Daniel considered the question. That may be the most important option. Nobody liked that answer. But nobody could refute it. The guild house had been designed to survive uncertainty. This was simply a new kind. They agreed to leave the relationship untouched. But they also agreed that no new systems would connect to it. The guild house would continue operating. The Treehouse project would continue. The TLP interface would remain voluntary and explicitly separate. The underground structure would not be entered. And the continuity relationship would be observed without interaction. It was a strange compromise. It satisfied nobody completely, which was probably why it worked. The decision was entered into the guild house's records, not as a secret, as a governance decision. That mattered to Daniel. He had begun to realize that secrecy and privacy were not the same thing. The discovery beneath the district was private because they were not yet ready to expose it. But the reason for withholding action could be recorded. Future people needed to know why the decision had been made. Otherwise, 20 years later, someone might find the unexplained underground relationship and assume that the people before them had simply forgotten to investigate it. Continuity required memory of uncertainty as much as memory of fact. The next development came from an unexpected direction. Daniel received a message from the local Economic Zone Council. The council wanted a meeting, not about the underground structure, about the treehouse. The request was more formal than the previous invitation. Several members had apparently become interested in the project's potential effect on local labor, housing, transportation, and development pressure. Daniel accepted. The meeting took place in an office overlooking a stretch of the district where luxury construction and older commercial activity existed almost side by side. From the windows, he could see cranes beyond the trees, hotel facades catching the afternoon light, and delivery vehicles moving through streets that had not been designed for the volume they now carried. The council members were polite. They were also worried. The first concern was housing. The second was infrastructure. The third was the increasing difficulty of maintaining a local workforce while the cost of living rose. The fourth was the concentration of high-value property. The fifth was political. One council member leaned forward. "Your tower could become a symbol." Daniel looked at him. "Of what?" "That's what we're trying to determine." Daniel smiled slightly. "That's dangerous." The council member smiled back. "Everything useful becomes symbolic eventually." Daniel didn't disagree. They discussed the treehouse for nearly 2 hours. The council did not ask for ownership. They asked for integration. Could the tower provide public services? Could it help stabilize housing? Could it support local manufacturing? Could it reduce dependence on imported goods? Could the food-growing systems reduce pressure on supply chains? Could the skyfishers use the infrastructure? Could the building serve as a training center? Could the maker spaces support local businesses? Could the gym and public park remain accessible? Could the tower become a model for other parts of the district? Daniel answered carefully, "Yes." Then he added, "But only if the project remains structurally independent." The council members looked at one another. One asked, "Independent from whom?" Daniel answered, "Everyone." That caused a longer silence. He continued, "Government should be able to interact with it. TLP should be able to interact with it. Businesses should be able to interact with it. Residents should be able to interact with it. But none of those relationships should make the building helpless when the relationship disappears." One council member leaned back. "You've thought about this recently?" The man smiled. "That's usually when people think about the important things." The meeting ended with something Daniel had not expected. The council offered support. Not funding. Not ownership. Support. They would help coordinate municipal interfaces. They would help streamline permits. They would facilitate communication with local services. They would support the project's public infrastructure components. It wasn't a blank check. Daniel preferred it that way. He left the building with Vaspar. She was unusually quiet. "What?" "Nothing." He looked at her. "You're learning from Tomás." She smiled. "No." "Then?" "I'm thinking about what happens when everyone wants a piece of the project." Daniel looked back toward the council building. "They don't get one. They'll try." "I know." "And TLP?" He looked at her. "TLP doesn't get one either." She nodded. "Good." They walked toward the vehicle. Then she stopped. "Daniel." He turned. The council used the word. "What word?" She looked at him. "Continuity." That evening, Daniel sat alone with the Treehouse plans. The building had become a negotiation among forces that had not existed when the first sketch was made. Residents wanted affordability. Businesses wanted opportunity. Municipal authorities wanted infrastructure. Developers wanted value. Skyfishers wanted access. Guilds wanted autonomy. TLP wanted interoperable sovereignty. Investors wanted scalability. And somewhere beneath the district, something unknown appeared to want continuity. The word had become unavoidable. Daniel wondered whether they were all using it to describe different things. For a municipality, continuity meant infrastructure that survived political cycles. For a guild, it meant knowledge that survived turnover. For TLP, it meant sovereign systems that survived external dependence. For a resident, it meant being able to remain in the place where they had built a life. For the buried system, whatever it was, continuity might mean something entirely different. Preservation, persistence, identity, memory, or simply survival. He looked at the tower. The answer could not be to satisfy all of them. The answer had to be to make the system capable of distinguishing among them. That was what the Treehouse was becoming. Not a machine that decided. A machine that remembered who had the right to decide. Later that night, Tomás found him on the roof. The city below was warm and luminous. The sea was invisible from that angle, but the air carried salt. "You haven't slept." Daniel smiled. "Neither have you." "I sleep badly." "Fair." Tomás leaned against the parapet. "The system is quiet." Daniel looked at him. "You can tell?" "Yes." "How?" Tomás shrugged. "Same way you know when a room is occupied." Daniel considered that. "Do you think it will come back?" Tomás looked toward the jungle. "Yes." "When?" "I don't know." "Do you think it's dangerous?" Tomás was silent. "Yes." Daniel waited. "Do you think it's hostile?" Tomás shook his head. "No." "What's the difference?" He looked at Daniel. "Something can be dangerous without wanting to hurt you." Daniel nodded. That was perhaps the most useful thing anyone had said about the problem. Tomás continued. "The system doesn't understand us." "How do you know?" "Because it keeps offering us choices." Daniel looked toward him. "And if it understood us?" Tomás looked back at the dark city. It wouldn't need to. The following morning, something happened that neither of them had anticipated. The guild house received a visitor. Not a government official. Not an investor. Not a journalist. An old man carrying a paper envelope. He had arrived by local bus and walked the rest of the way. He introduced himself to the receptionist as a retired communications technician. He had heard about the treehouse. He wanted to donate something. The receptionist brought him into the public atrium. Daniel happened to be there. The old man opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph. It showed a group of technicians standing beside a piece of equipment in a jungle clearing. The photograph was old. Very old. Daniel looked at it. He recognized the terrain. The same ridge. The same trees. The same kind of service road. The same location they had visited. He turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back. A date. And a single sentence. Continuity test successful. Daniel looked at the old man. Where did you get this? My father. Who were these people? My father was one of them. What were they doing? The man shook his head. He never told me. Why bring it here? The old man looked toward the treehouse model. Because he told me something once. What? The old man hesitated. Then he said, if they ever start building there again, find the people who understand what the machines are for. Daniel felt the hairs rise on his arms. He glanced at the photograph again. One of the people in it was standing slightly apart from the others. The face was partly obscured by shadow, but Daniel could see enough. He looked at Tomás. Tomás had entered the atrium without anyone noticing. He was staring at the photograph. The old man followed his gaze. Then he looked at Tomás. His expression changed. Not recognition exactly. Something close. You're still here, he whispered. Tomás went pale. Daniel stepped between them. What did you say? The old man looked frightened now. I said nothing. You did. The man closed his hand around the photograph. Daniel saw his fingers trembling. Who is he? The old man looked at Tomás. I don't know. Then he turned toward the door. Daniel stopped him. Wait. The old man pulled free. I shouldn't have come. He walked out. Daniel followed him into the courtyard. By the time he reached the street, the man was already gone. The photograph remained in Daniel's hand. He looked back toward the guild house. Tomás stood beneath the trees. Vaspar had joined him. Neither spoke. Daniel returned inside. He placed the photograph on the table. Nobody touched it. The old man's father had been there. The underground system had been there. The continuity test had been there. And now the treehouse was being built above it. Daniel looked at Tomás. Did you know him? Tomás shook his head. No. Did you recognize him? No. Then why did he say you're still here? Tomás stared at the photograph. I don't know. Vaspar moved closer. Maybe he wasn't talking to you. Tomás looked at her. She pointed to the photograph. At first Daniel saw nothing. Then he noticed the person standing behind the others. The face remained mostly hidden. But one detail was unmistakable. The person was looking directly at the camera. And on the equipment beside him was the same symbol they had found in the old geological notebook. The same symbol that had appeared on the neural architecture. The same symbol that had marked the unexplained archive. Daniel stared at it. Then he looked at the treehouse. For the first time, the tower did not look like something they were building over an old mystery. It looked like something whose construction had become visible to an old system that had been waiting for the right architecture to appear. Chapter 150. The photograph. The photograph remained on the table until the lights in the atrium began switching themselves to their evening cycle. Nobody touched it. Daniel had put it inside a transparent evidence sleeve, although calling it evidence still felt premature. It was simply an old photograph that had appeared at the guild house in the hands of a man who had seemed genuinely frightened by what he saw when he looked at Tomás. The distinction mattered. Daniel had spent enough time around institutions to know how quickly an unexplained object acquired an official identity once somebody put it into a database. After that, every subsequent person approached it with the assumptions of the first. So for the moment, it was only a photograph. The paper had softened at the edges with age. There was a crease running diagonally through one corner, and someone had once folded it in half. The image itself had faded unevenly, leaving the sky almost white while the vegetation remained dark enough to obscure some of the details. 6 people stood beside a piece of equipment in a clearing. Behind them was the low limestone ridge Daniel now knew contained an engineered cavity. The photograph had been taken there. That much was certain. The date written on the reverse was not. Daniel had checked it against the geological records 3 times. The date placed the photograph several years before the earliest official survey of the site, which meant either the photograph was misdated or the official history was incomplete. Neither possibility was particularly comforting. Vaspar stood on the other side of the table, looking at the photograph without touching it. "You keep staring at the man." Daniel looked at her. "I keep staring at all of them." "No." She pointed toward the enlarged image on the wall. "The one in the back." Daniel turned. The image had been projected at low resolution onto a white panel. They had enlarged it as much as the available scan allowed, which made the photograph look less like a historical document and more like a badly reconstructed memory. Faces dissolved into pixels. Clothing became blocks of gray and brown. The equipment beside them lost all useful definition. But the man at the back remained distinct enough to be troubling. He stood slightly apart, not posing, watching. He was looking directly toward the camera. Daniel had initially assumed it was coincidence. People in photographs often looked toward the person taking them. Except everyone else was looking at the equipment. The man wasn't. "He knows he's being photographed," Daniel said. Vaspar nodded. "Yes. That's not unusual." "No. But..." She folded her arms. "He isn't looking at the camera." Daniel looked again. She was right. The camera was slightly left of center. The man's eyes were directed farther left, toward something outside the frame. Daniel enlarged that portion of the image. The pixels became meaningless. What was he looking at? Maybe the person taking the picture. Maybe. Vaspar looked toward Tomás. He had not spoken since they brought the photograph into the room. He was sitting near the window with his back against the wall, his hands loosely clasped between his knees. The expression on his face was difficult to read. Daniel had learned not to ask him the same question repeatedly. It didn't make memories arrive faster. Sometimes pressure seemed to make them less reliable. Instead he asked, "Does anything about the photograph feel familiar?" Tomás looked at the projection. "Not the photograph. The place." "Yes. Anything specific?" He stared at the image for a long time. Then he shook his head. "I remember the light." Vaspar turned. "The light. The sun." He closed his eyes. It was later in the day. Daniel looked at the date. "You remember that?" "No." Tomás opened his eyes. "I remember thinking I was going to be cold." The room went quiet. Vaspar looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the photograph. The photograph had been taken in daylight. There was nothing in it that suggested cold. But Daniel had learned enough about memory by now to understand that people did not remember events as photographs. A smell could unlock a room. A temperature could summon a face. A sound could return an entire sequence without bringing back the facts necessary to explain it. "Was there water?" Vaspar asked. Tomás hesitated. "Yes." "Underground?" "I don't know." "Above you?" He thought. "Both." Daniel watched him carefully. "Anything else?" Tomás rubbed his forehead. There was a machine. Daniel pointed toward the photograph. That one. No. Then what machine? I don't know. He looked embarrassed. Sorry. You don't have to apologize. Tomás nodded. I know. But he looked as though he wanted to. The old man had left no contact information. That bothered Daniel more than it should have. A person who arrived carrying a historical photograph and then disappeared without leaving an address could be interpreted in 100 ways. He might simply have panicked. He might have decided he had made a mistake. He might have been embarrassed. He might have wanted to remain anonymous. Or he might have known precisely what he was doing. The man had arrived shortly after 10. Daniel asked the receptionist to review the entrance records. The man had arrived shortly after 10. He had paid for his bus fare with cash. He had not used the Guildhouse network. He had not carried a detectable communications device beyond an old mobile telephone that had never connected to the local system. He had entered alone. He had left alone. The exterior cameras showed him walking toward the road. Then the camera lost him behind a delivery vehicle. He did not reappear. Daniel watched the footage twice. How long was he out of frame? 23 seconds. Where does the road lead? 2 directions. Traffic. Enough. So we lost him. The security technician nodded. Yes. Daniel looked at the screen. Anything unusual? No. That answer irritated him. Not because it was wrong, because it was probably true. The man had entered the Guildhouse like an ordinary visitor and left like an ordinary visitor. Whatever significance he carried existed entirely inside the information he had chosen to bring with him. Daniel turned off the footage. Keep it. The technician looked at him. For how long? Indefinitely. The next morning they returned to the photograph. This time Elena was there. She had brought old maps. The photograph was placed beside the geological survey. Then beside the current treehouse site plan. Then beside a satellite image. The clearing in the photograph was difficult to locate at first because the surrounding vegetation had changed dramatically. Roads had appeared and disappeared. Trees had grown. Some had been cut. Drainage patterns had altered. Construction had reshaped portions of the terrain. But the ridge remained. Elena traced it with her finger. Here. Daniel looked. You're certain? Yes. She placed the historical photograph above the map. The angle was almost correct. Not exact, but close. The old clearing had been here. The service road had approached from this direction. The ridge had been behind the equipment, and the underground cavity was directly beneath it. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Elena said, "There's something wrong." Daniel looked at her. What? The photograph. She pointed to the vegetation. Those trees. What about them? They're older than the date on the photograph. Daniel looked again. How do you know? I've spent years mapping vegetation succession in this area. She traced several of the larger trees. These would have been mature before this picture was taken. Vaspar frowned. Could the date be wrong? Yes. Then we have no date. Not necessarily. Elena looked toward the photograph. There are other ways. She opened a field database. The equipment. Daniel leaned closer. The machine beside the technicians was partially obscured, but a section of its housing remained visible. Elena enlarged it. A serial plate. Barely legible. She ran the image through several enhancement processes. The result was still incomplete. But 3 characters appeared. Then 4. Enough to search. The database returned nothing. The engineers searched commercial archives. Nothing. Industrial registries. Nothing. Historical procurement records. Nothing. The machine did not appear to exist. Daniel sat back. That's impossible. Elena looked at him. No. She shook her head. It's not impossible. What is it? A machine that was never commercially registered. Custom built. Possibly. By whom? She looked at the photograph. That's the question. The Guild House's archive was beginning to acquire the character of a crime scene. Not because anyone had been murdered, because too many unrelated records were beginning to point toward the same absence. A survey that omitted a cavity, a machine without a registry, a photograph with a questionable date, a continuity process nobody remembered installing, a network relationship with no endpoint, a retired technician who recognized Tomás. And somewhere below the district, a structure that had apparently been designed to remain useful without remaining visible. Daniel found himself increasingly uncomfortable with the word secret. Secrets were usually things somebody knew. This was different. It was an infrastructure of omission. The system did not seem to depend on everyone knowing the truth. It depended on everyone knowing only enough to perform their assigned function. The geologist surveyed. The technician maintained. The official restricted. The contractor built. The archivist filed. The resident forgot. The system persisted. Daniel wrote the observation into his private notebook. He did not put it into the Guild House archive. Not yet. Some thoughts needed to remain provisional. That afternoon, the government representative returned. This time he came alone. He asked to speak privately. Daniel brought him into one of the smaller rooms overlooking the courtyard. The man looked tired. I asked about the request. And it wasn't supposed to reach you. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That's reassuring. I mean, it wasn't initiated by our office. Then whose? I don't know. Daniel waited. The man removed a folded document from his jacket. I found this. Daniel opened it. It was an old administrative memo. No modern letterhead. No digital identifier. No clear author. The paper had been photocopied so many times that the original text was difficult to read. At the top was a phrase, Continuity Infrastructure Restricted Coordination. Daniel looked at the date. It was decades old. He read further. The memo discussed geological survey coordination, communication security, and long-term retention of operational knowledge. There was no mention of a facility, no mention of experiments, no mention of people. But one paragraph caught Daniel's attention. He read it twice, then again. It referred to distributed retention nodes that were not to be consolidated into a single administrative authority. Daniel looked up. What does this mean? The government representative shook his head. I don't know. Who wrote it? We can't determine that. Who preserved it? We don't know. Daniel leaned back. You understand why this is beginning to look deliberate. The man looked at him. I understand why you're concerned. That's not the same thing. No. He looked down. There are people in government who believe these records relate to old strategic infrastructure. And you? I believe people in government believe many things. Daniel smiled. That's diplomatic. I'm trying to keep my job. Fair. The man folded his hands. There is another problem. Daniel waited. Someone has started asking about the treehouse. Who? I don't know. You're going to have to improve your answers. The man looked genuinely frustrated. We're dealing with requests that originate outside the normal chain. Daniel's expression changed. How? Departments receive requests. The requests look legitimate. They reference real projects, real legal authorities, real planning requirements. But the underlying questions don't match the stated purpose. Daniel thought about the historical infrastructure request. Who is asking? We don't know. Then how do you know they're connected? The man looked at him. Because we've seen the same pattern elsewhere. He did not elaborate. Daniel didn't push. The government representative was not his enemy, and turning a frightened bureaucrat into an informant would accomplish little. Instead, Daniel asked the more important question. Are you asking us to stop? No. Then what? I'm asking you not to assume that everyone who approaches the treehouse wants to invest in it. Daniel smiled without humor. We figured that out. The man stood. At the door he stopped. One more thing. Daniel looked at him. Do not send the photograph through any government archive. Why? He hesitated. Because if it exists there already, we don't know where. Then he left. Daniel remained in the room. Vaspar had been listening from the adjoining office. She entered. He knows more than he's saying. Yes. Do you trust him? Enough. She looked at the document. That might be the most dangerous answer you've given lately. That night, the guild house experienced its first deliberate blackout. Not an outage. A test. Daniel had ordered the external connections disabled for 15 minutes. No TLP synchronization. No municipal feeds. No public network. No outside data. The building continued operating. Lights remained on. Water continued moving. Food systems maintained their cycles. The workshops continued. The Skyfish landing platform switched to local navigation. The residential tubes continued their environmental control. The continuity archive remained active. Daniel watched the system status. Everything was green. Then the archive generated a request. External peer, unresolved. He expected that. What he didn't expect was the next line. Local continuity, stable. Then, physical interface, available. Daniel stared at the screen. The engineer beside him looked at the floor. What does that mean? Daniel didn't answer. The system had never previously referred to a physical interface. They checked every documented interface in the building. Nothing. No unauthorized port. No hidden network connection. No unexplained hardware. Then Elena called from the geological monitoring station. We've got movement. Daniel went downstairs. The geological display showed the old underground cavity. There had been a small change. Not structural movement. Pressure. The readings had changed by a fraction. Daniel watched the graph. It wasn't enough to indicate collapse. It wasn't enough to indicate an earthquake. It was something else. Pressure differential. Controlled change. He looked at the timestamp. It had occurred exactly when the external network was disconnected. Vaspar arrived. Coincidence? Daniel shook his head. I don't know. Tomás came behind her. He looked at the display. His expression changed. Turn the network back on. Daniel looked at him. Why? Because we're making it think we're gone. The room became quiet. Daniel stared at him. You said it recognized us. It did. Then why would shutting down the network matter? Because maybe the network is part of what it recognizes. Daniel thought, then nodded. The external connection was restored. The pressure began returning toward its previous level. Slowly. Not immediately, but unmistakably. Nobody spoke. Tomás watched the graph. It noticed. Daniel looked at him. Or we caused it. Tomás nodded. That's possible. Vaspar looked at the screen. Then we have a problem. Daniel shook his head. No. He looked at the building around them. The problem is that we're still thinking of this as a conversation. They looked at him. It's a system. He pointed toward the graph. We change something. Changes something. We change it back. Changes back. We don't know whether that's communication, adaptation, coincidence, or some combination of all three. He paused. But until we know, we have to stop treating every response as a message. Tomás looked at him. And what do we treat it as? Daniel looked toward the ceiling. toward the floors above them where people were still living ordinary lives. Behavior. That word changed the investigation. It gave them something they could work with. They didn't need to understand the system yet. They needed to observe it, document it, map its reactions, separate what they caused from what they merely noticed. Stop interpreting every coincidence as intent. And, above all, keep the treehouse moving forward. Because the greatest mistake they could make now would be to let an unknown system beneath the district become the center of a project that had been created for the people above it. The next morning, Daniel returned to the architectural office. The treehouse plans were spread across the table. For the first time in several days, he felt almost relieved to be looking at something that belonged to the future rather than the past. The tower was still changing. The public park had gained more shade. The maker floor had acquired additional repair bays. The skyfishers had expanded their maintenance area. The food systems were being revised. The residential tubes had been reorganized. The gym had become more ambitious. The children had somehow added an enormous climbing structure to the atrium. Daniel looked at it. Who approved that? The architect smiled. The children. Of course. He sat down. There was something reassuring about the mess. The treehouse wasn't finished. It wasn't supposed to be. People were still arguing over it, changing it, breaking it, repairing it, making it theirs. Daniel looked through the windows toward the jungle. Somewhere below, an old system was waiting. Perhaps it had been waiting for decades. Perhaps longer. Perhaps it had recognized Tomás. Perhaps it had recognized Vaspar. Perhaps it had recognized the architecture. Perhaps it recognized nothing at all. Daniel closed the geological file. He opened the treehouse plans. There was work to do. And for now, that was enough.
Bolivar, the bankster's liberator. A forbidden history of Simón Bolívar and the invention of modern servitude. MXDM,
the banker's liberator, the debt that called itself freedom. 2 centuries after his bones were dug up for the cameras, Bolivar still owes the world an explanation. Not for what he fought, but for who financed the fight. Behind every cry of liberty was a ledger. Behind every revolution, a banker counting bayonets as assets. And behind the marble hero they sold us, a man broken by Parisian debts, refitted by London credit, and embalmed in interest. The republics that rose in his name were plantations reborn as portfolios. The chains became contracts. The whip, an exchange rate. Freedom, our first and most seductive loan. They called him the liberator. History may yet remember him as the world's first collateralized saint. Hashtag pirate first, hashtag Bolivar, hashtag forbidden history, hashtag debt is empire, hashtag financial colonialism, hashtag the banker's liberator, hashtag history is ledger, hashtag post-empire chronicles, hashtag Parada Primera.
This is awakening. Change begins now.
Techno-nomads who arbitrated the fall of nations.
The Salvage Protocol 2.0 Mirrorback Continuum. The hybrid Renaissance era is a direct, reverent continuation, not a sequel that overwrites, but an evolution that grows from the codebase of the Gospel of Function. In tone, the same balance of poetic reportage and technical scripture is kept. In substance, it honors everything that came before: Pirate First's ruthless compassion, the Chrome Communion, the Choir, the Luminal Order, and show how their echoes seed a solar civilization built not on domination, but maintenance as art. Let's proceed seamlessly.
sovereign without spectacle. We claim our own path.
Pirate First's Outlaw Secession, Burning the Admiral's Map. MXTM's Newsletter Dispatch. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. August 9th, 2026. Burning the Admiral's Map. To truly comprehend the Zeta Mail, ye must look past the petty posturing of the shorebound world and examine the uncompromising ethos of the High Seas Pirate Charter. Not the theme park version with the parrot and the eye patch, but the one sitting in the historical record. Between roughly 1750...
They missed the real load. Millions of students in the developing world self-taught on what got torn time for fun to know. That's the honor-rated scholarship that built the InDesign. Untire-rated software in the 2000s grind. And who trained the neural networks on the stairs by rise. Stolen C, the trillion-dollar models that run the industry. Kept in A's, fed on pirate archives while the lawyers turn their eyes. So don't talk to me about theft, this is how it always worked. The Buccaneers fed the colony before the model learned. The shadow engine ran and then the credit got transferred. They built William and Mary on the silver that we stole. They built the future on the corpus that we broke out of control.
Take a long look, matey. The city on the horizon be ripe for the taking, and the tide be turning in our favor as the sun dips below the waves.
The algorithms say we don't exist. The graphs come back empty. The metrics insist. No audience, no market, no trend. Yet somehow we keep arriving again, walking through the ruins of somebody else's plan, watching perfect narratives slip through their own hands.
The people who are already here. A note for the untabulated: the algorithms say you don't exist. The institutions say you are statistically insignificant. The market says there are not enough of you to matter. And yet here you are. Again. Reading things nobody is supposed to read. Thinking thoughts nobody is supposed to think. The pretending is getting harder. Not because people are waking up, that's too romantic. Because the distance between the official story and the lived reality has widened to the point where maintenance takes visible effort. What you're looking for, what brought you here, is not someone to tell you what to think. You've already done the thinking. What you're looking for is proof that someone else did the thinking too, arrived somewhere close to where you are, and didn't collapse under the weight of it. That's this. Not a movement. Not a faction. Not a subscription to someone else's conclusions.
The waiting game is already underway. Occupy, build, garden, govern.
I just finished writing a book I didn't plan to write. It started as a countercultural addendum to the Aldea Zamá, Post-Corporate Transition District Handbook, a rougher, more urgent document aimed at the generation the credential economy forgot to accommodate. It became something else.
Nowhere less whispers, no discord begging, no roadmap.